The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and the bullet disappeared into white. Nothing. Nora Calloway held her breath, held her position, waited for the indicator downrange to flash. The wind hit first, 40 knots from the northwest, screaming across the qualification range at Fort Caldwell with the kind of focused cruelty that felt personal. The kind of cold that didn't just steal heat, it reached inside and took something else, something harder to name. The range instructor's voice came through her earpiece. Flat, final, target 1, no impact. She adjusted, found the second target through her scope. The crosshairs drifted, not from nerves. Her fingers had stopped responding to commands about 20 minutes ago. The cold had eaten through her gloves, through her skin, into the tendons that controlled the fine motor work of marksmanship. She was shooting with hands that belonged to someone else. Second shot. Miss. Behind her, she heard it. Not words yet, just the shift of weight. Boots on frozen ground. The particular sound of men who have already decided the outcome, watching it confirm itself. She found the third target. Her hands were trembling now, not from fear, from physics. At 119 pounds, in a 40-knot crosswind, her body was doing the math it always did, compensating for the force trying to push her sideways. And that compensation traveled down through her shoulders, through her arms, into the stock of the rifle, into the barrel, into every shot she would take for the rest of this qualification. Third shot, wide. Fourth shot, hit. Fifth shot, hit. 2 out of 5. The minimum passing score was 4. Staff Sergeant Dalloway didn't wait for the official call. He said it loud enough for everyone on the firing line to hear, loud enough that the words would still be in the air when she turned around. Called it week 1. She didn't turn around. She safed the rifle, stepped back from the line, stood at attention in snow that came up past her ankles, while the wind pushed against her like a hand that had made up its mind. Sergeant Vance approached from the right. He was the kind of instructor who delivered bad news quietly, which made it worse. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. Calloway, Sergeant. He held up one hand against the wind, palm out, fingers spread. Feel that? She felt it. 43 knots sustained, gusting to 51. He looked at her hands, still locked around the rifle out of habit. You weigh 119 pounds. The rifle weighs 14. In these conditions, every time the wind hits you, your center of gravity shifts. You compensate. The compensation introduces tremor. Tremor at this range means miss. I understand, Sergeant. It's not about want, Calloway. It's not about heart. It's about physics. He paused. Your body mass to wind resistance ratio falls below the operational threshold. You know this. Yes, Sergeant. Pack your gear. Bus to Anchorage leaves at 0600. You'll process out there. He started to walk away, stopped without turning back. For what it's worth, indoor range, controlled conditions, you'd have qualified top 3. I've seen your scores. He paused one more time. You're a shooter, Calloway. Just not in this environment. Then he was gone. Nora stood in the snow for a long time after that. Long enough that the rest of the trainees filed past her, some avoiding eye contact, some not bothering to avoid it. Dalloway passed last. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The way he walked past her, the slight angle of his shoulders, the pace of a man who had already moved on, said everything his voice hadn't. She picked up her gear and walked to the barracks. The building was nearly empty by 9. Most of the company had gone to the rec hall. She could hear it from 2 buildings over, voices carrying through the cold, the muffled sound of people celebrating futures that had just become official. Nora sat on her stripped bunk, duffel half packed. The only light came from a bare bulb overhead that flickered each time the wind stressed the power lines hard enough. Her phone lay face down on the mattress beside her. She turned it over. 3 messages. Her father, Earl Calloway, former Marine, currently running 43 head of cattle on a ranch outside Sheridan, Wyoming, with hands that had spent more years holding a rifle than anything else. His message was one line: you gave it everything. That's the only math that matters. She read it twice, set the phone down, looked at the ceiling. The thing about failure, she had decided at some point during the last 16 weeks, was that it didn't arrive all at once. It came in stages, the way the cold came in. First you felt it in your hands, then your arms, then your chest. And by the time it reached your core, you understood that it had been there for hours, working its way inward, and you had simply been too busy to notice. She started folding clothes. Stack, fold, pack. The muscle memory of a woman who had been leaving places her whole life. Her mother had died when Nora was 7, lung cancer. It happened in November, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. And the thing Nora remembered most clearly about that day was not the moment itself, but the drive home afterward. Her father hadn't spoken. He had driven with both hands on the wheel, and his jaw set in a way she had never seen before. And she had understood, even at 7, that silence was sometimes the only honest response to things that had no honest answer. They had managed after that, the two of them, the ranch, the rifle, the long, quiet hours of winter when the snow came in off the mountains, and the world contracted to the size of what you could see through a scope. Earl had started taking her shooting when she was 9, not to train her, not because he had some plan. He took her because it was something they could do together without having to talk, and because in the field, lying flat in the snow beside her father, watching the same distant point he was watching, she felt close to him in a way that ordinary life didn't allow. He taught her the way his own instructor had taught him, from the inside out. Don't fight the cold, he would say. Become part of it. Don't breathe against it. Breathe with it. Find the wind's rhythm and let your body match it. So when you finally go still, you don't look like someone hiding. You look like something that was always there. She had been 12 the first time she held her breath for 3 minutes on a frozen hillside while a mule deer walked past at 20 feet and never knew she was there. She had been 14 when she first understood that her particular body, small, quiet, low heat, was not a disadvantage in the field. It was a different kind of tool, not louder, not faster, not designed for the same work, but designed for a different work that most people didn't have a name for yet. The light flickered. Outside, the wind had picked up again, the kind of sustained roar that made the walls vibrate at a frequency you felt in your sternum. She could hear the rec hall from here, distant but present, the sound of people with tomorrows. She folded the last shirt. She did not cry. She had made that decision in week 3, when Dalloway had found her in the latrine after a particularly brutal night ruck, and made sure every man in the barracks knew about it by morning. She hadn't cried since, not out of pride, out of efficiency. Crying cost time and warmth, and she had not had a surplus of either. She turned the phone face up again, looked at her father's message. You gave it everything. She thought about writing back, tried to find the words for what she was going to say when she got home. The specific sentence that explained how 16 weeks of 4:30 mornings and 30-mile rucks and lifting weights designed for bodies twice her size had ended on a firing line with 2 hits out of 5 and a bus to Anchorage at 0600. She couldn't find the sentence. She put the phone down and listened to the wind. That was when she heard the other sound. Rotor blades. Helicopters didn't fly in this weather. The base had grounded all air assets 6 hours ago when the storm hit severe warning levels. She had heard the announcement herself over the PA, the flat official voice reading wind speed and visibility data and concluding with the words, all aircraft grounded until further notice. So the sound she was hearing was not possible, but it was there, growing louder. She moved to the window, wiped frost from the glass with her sleeve, pressed her face close. A helicopter, black, no visible markings, no running lights, dropped out of the blizzard the way a stone drops through water. Not falling, descending, controlled and deliberate, and completely without hesitation. It touched down on the parade ground with the precision of a pilot who had done this in worse conditions and found them unremarkable. The rotors kept turning. Snow blasted outward in a perfect circle. A figure stepped out. He didn't run. He didn't hunch against the wind. He walked at the steady pace of a man who considered the weather a personal matter between himself and the storm, one he had already settled. The barracks door opened. No knock. Colonel Raymond Hask stood in the doorway, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Not from the cold he had let in, from the man himself. He was not what she expected. Not tall, perhaps 5'10", lean, somewhere in his early 50s, with the kind of face that had been worked on by things worse than weather. His eyes were the color of deep glacier ice, pale and still and absolutely precise in the way they moved. Those eyes found her immediately, the way a scope finds a target, not searching, already there. Nora Calloway. His voice was the same temperature as the room. It wasn't a question. She stood anyway. Sir. He stepped inside, closed the door. The sound of the storm muffled but didn't disappear, like something that had agreed to wait. He looked at her half-packed duffel, her hands still stiff and red from the range, the phone on the mattress. Then he looked at her face. You failed qualification today. Yes, sir. Why? The question landed differently than she expected. No one had asked her why. They had told her why. She repeated what she'd been told. Insufficient body mass to stabilize the firing platform in sustained wind conditions, sir. Center of gravity displacement exceeding the compensatory threshold. Tremor introduced through. That's their answer. His voice didn't change in volume or temperature, but something shifted in it. I asked for yours. Nora met his eyes. Something in them, not kindness exactly, but an absence of the judgment that had been in every other set of eyes she'd faced today, made her honest. I'm not big enough, sir, not to hold the rifle steady when the wind is trying to move me. I trained harder than anyone in this company, and it didn't matter. My body cannot do what they needed it to do in those conditions. He looked at her for a long moment. Wrong. She blinked. Your body cannot do what they needed it to do. He moved into the barracks slow, looking at the empty bunks, the cleared lockers. That is a different statement than what you think it is. He turned back to her. How long can you hold your breath? Sir, answer the question. 3 minutes, sir. 3.5 on a good day, resting. Heart rate right now? She checked instinctively. 61, sir. Under stress? Never above 66, even during stress inoculation. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he pulled a tablet from inside his jacket and activated it. The image on the screen was a thermal satellite photograph, a mountain range she didn't recognize. Snow-covered ridges, deep valleys, a cluster of heat signatures on a high ridgeline, red and orange against the blue-white of the surrounding terrain. What you're looking at, Hask said, is a denied area 85 miles inside hostile territory. Command post on a ridge at 10,800 feet. The people operating there are coordinating a weapons pipeline that has killed 41 Allied personnel in the last 5 months. Nora studied the image. Her brain shifted without being told. Stopped processing the day's failures. Started processing the problem in front of her. Fortified position, sir. High ground. Correct. Approach routes are limited, all exposed above the tree line. Also correct. She calculated. Ground team would be visible on thermal imaging from at least 2 kilometers out. 3, Hask said. They have advanced scanning equipment. He closed the image. Every team we've sent has been detected and driven back. 2 operators were killed. 3 more were wounded. She waited. He looked at her without flinching, the way a man looks at a problem he has been turning over long enough to know its edges. I need one person, one shooter, someone who can be inserted alone, move 18 kilometers through hostile territory without being detected, set up a position within 300 meters of that command post, and remain motionless for up to 8 hours in -35-degree conditions. Nora said nothing. I need someone whose body temperature runs low enough to defeat thermal scanning. Someone whose heart rate stays below the detection threshold without pharmaceutical assistance. Someone who can control their breathing so completely that they produce zero visible vapor cloud in sub-zero air. He paused. I need someone the enemy's equipment literally cannot see. Nora's throat went dry, but Hask wasn't finished. 4 months ago, he said, during winter field exercises, I found someone who did all of that without trying. He turned the tablet toward her. You remember Exercise Whiteout, January. Your squad was tasked with establishing a concealed observation post during a blizzard. She remembered it precisely. The frozen creek bed, the water that had soaked through her underlayer, the 5 hours of lying completely still in a drainage depression while her squad moved on without her. They didn't notice I was missing for 2 hours, sir. They didn't. When your squad leader finally called it in, my observation team ran thermal scans to locate you. He held her gaze. You didn't appear on any scan. The operators recalibrated 3 times, replaced a sensor unit. They filed a report attributing the gap to equipment malfunction. A pause. The equipment wasn't malfunctioning. No, sir, you were simply not there. Thermally. For 6 hours, in the same location. He leaned forward slightly. Every other trainee in that exercise was actively trying to conceal themselves. Digging in, building shelters, creating heat and movement and noise in the process of trying to hide. You did nothing except stay still. And in doing nothing, you became invisible to every detection system my team was running. Nora remembered the creek bed. She hadn't been trying to be invisible. She had been trying to survive, trying to stay warm by staying still, the way her father had taught her during their first winter hunting trips in the Bighorn Mountains. Don't fight the cold. Become part of it. She had been doing exactly that, not as a tactic, as a habit. Sir, she said carefully, I appreciate what you're saying, but I just failed basic qualification. I am not a trained operator. I'm a trainee who washed out 12 hours ago. You're not qualified for their mission. He stood. He moved to the door. The rotors were still turning outside. She could feel the vibration through the floor. I'm offering you mine. He opened the door. The storm came back in, not violent this time, just present, a reminder. The helicopter leaves in 5 minutes. Pack survival gear only, no personal items, no phone calls. He looked at her one final time before stepping out. Your father taught you to become part of the cold. I need someone who was born that way. The door swung nearly shut behind him. Nora stood in the empty barracks. Heart rate 63. Hands still stiff. Brain processing at a speed that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the particular stillness that had lived in her since she was a 9-year-old girl, lying in the snow beside her father, learning that the most dangerous thing you could become was something no one could see. She looked at her duffel, her phone, her father's message still on the screen. You gave it everything. That's the only math that matters. She thought about Earl at his kitchen table in Wyoming right now. The way he would be sitting with his coffee, waiting for her to call. 11 years of looking for a man who had gone missing and never been found. The way certain kinds of grief didn't diminish with time. They just became part of the furniture, part of the daily calculation of how to keep moving. She thought about 2 operators who hadn't come home from those mountains. She thought about 41 names she didn't know. She stripped the duffel to essentials, cold weather gear, survival equipment, the dead man's switch Hask had left on the bunk, a device the size of a lighter with a single button and a green LED. She pressed it once. It began its 12-hour count. She left the phone on the mattress, face up, her father's message still visible. She walked to the door and put her hand on the handle. In 5 minutes, she would be on that helicopter. In 2 hours, she would be dropping through darkness into terrain that had already killed 2 people better qualified than her. In 12 hours, she would be lying motionless on a frozen ridge in conditions her own base had declared unflying weather, doing the one thing she had always done better than anyone: disappearing. The cold hit her like a wall when she opened the door. She didn't brace against it, didn't tense. She let it in the way she had always let it in, and felt her body begin its slow and practiced descent toward invisible. The helicopter waited, rotors turning, Colonel Hask already inside. She climbed aboard, the door sealed behind her. The aircraft lifted immediately, banking hard into the blizzard, and Fort Caldwell, the place that had measured her and found her wanting, vanished beneath white. Nora Calloway had failed basic qualification. She was about to find out that failure was the only credential that mattered for what came next. The helicopter banked hard left, and Nora's shoulder hit the cabin wall. She found a handhold, steadied herself, looked across the dim interior. Hask sat strapped in across from her, tablet on his knees, face lit by the pale screen glow. Two men occupied the bench to her left. She recognized the type before she registered the details. The way they breathed, contained and slow and without waste, the particular calm of men who had walked into enough dangerous places. That calm had stopped being an achievement and become a default. Neither of them looked at her. "Gentlemen," Hask said without looking up, "this is Shadow One." The larger of the two, square jaw, thick neck, the build of a man who had spent 2 decades making his body into a specific kind of tool, glanced at Nora for exactly 1 second, then back to Hask. "Commander, she hasn't finished basic." Noted. "She's a trainee." Also noted. The man's jaw tightened. "We're sending a trainee alone into a denied area where 2 qualified operators were killed last month." Hask looked up from the tablet. "Chief Warrant Kareth. What happened to those operators?" Kareth's expression didn't change. "Detected at 2 clicks. Mortar response within 90 seconds. Why were they detected?" Silence. "Because they were over 200 pounds of body heat moving through -30 terrain." Hask's voice remained exactly the same temperature it had been since he walked into the barracks. Their thermal signatures were visible from 1.5 kilometers. He turned the tablet toward Nora. "She won't be." Kareth looked at Nora again, longer this time, measuring. "How old are you?" 23. "Ever been in a hostile area?" "No." "Ever made a decision that decided whether someone else lived or died?" "No." He turned back to Hask. "Commander, I didn't bring her here because of what she's done, Kareth." Hask's voice didn't rise. It lowered, which somehow carried further. "I brought her because of what she is." He pulled up a new image on the tablet. "Brief her." Kareth held Hask's gaze for a 3 count. Then something shifted, not agreement, but the operational decision to proceed, which in this world was close enough. He leaned forward. "Harrow Range, 85 miles inside the denial zone. Your insertion point is the valley floor. Elevation 6,000 feet. Your target position is here. Ridge at 10,800. Distance between insertion and objective, 18 kilometers." "Through what terrain?" Nora asked. The second man on the bench spoke for the first time. Younger, quieter. Name tape, Slade. "Enemy patrol rotations run 4-hour cycles. At minimum, 3 teams of 4. They know we've been trying to get eyes on that ridge. They're hunting for an infiltrator as actively as we're hunting for their command structure." Nora studied the imagery. "What's the composition of the command post itself?" "Semi-permanent structure," Kareth said. "Reinforced. Thermal shielding on 3 sides. 8 to 12 personnel at any given time. Guard rotation every 90 minutes. These are not irregular forces. They are trained, disciplined, and they have been operating in that terrain long enough to know it the way you know your own backyard." Hask closed the imagery. "Primary mission is observation and intelligence gathering, patrol patterns, communication schedules, supply routes. Secondary mission is interdiction." He looked at her directly. "If a clean shot presents itself at the field commander, call sign Viper, you take it. And if no clean shot presents itself, then you remain in position until one does, or until 72 hours pass and the next weather system moves through for extraction cover. 72 hours, 3 days on a frozen ridge, alone, no backup, no support. What's my extraction plan? The cabin went quiet. Even the engine noise seemed to pull back. There isn't one, Hask said, not until the mission is complete. If you're compromised, there is a secondary extraction point 18 kilometers northwest of your objective position. You reach it on your own. On my own? Yes, Kareth looked at the floor. Slade shifted in his seat. Nora did the math quickly and honestly. Sir, if I'm compromised at the observation point and need to move 18 kilometers through alerted enemy territory, what is my realistic survival probability? Hask didn't look away. Low, he paused, but higher than 0, which is more than I can say for the last 4 operators I sent. He reached under his seat and lifted a hard case onto the bench between them. Opened it. Inside was a rifle unlike anything she had trained with. Compact, matte black, suppressor integrated into the barrel as though it had been designed that way from the beginning rather than added. The stock was shorter than standard, built for a smaller frame. The lines of it were clean and purposeful in the way that working tools are purposeful, without anything extra. Custom platform, Hask said. Shitac M200 intervention. 408 caliber. Subsonic load. Suppressed at the source. Effective range depends entirely on the shooter. Nora picked it up. The weight was wrong. Too light. Like holding a decision rather than a weapon. But her hands found the grip without instruction. Her index finger settled naturally beside the trigger guard. It feels like it was built for you, Hask said. It was, or rather, it was built for someone your size. He closed the case. We commissioned it 3 years ago for an operator profile that never materialized. Until now, Nora said. He looked at her. For the first time, something almost imperceptible shifted at the edges of his expression. Until now. He handed her the dead man's switch. Check in every 12 hours. Single press. Green light confirms receipt. If 12 hours pass without contact, we assume you are compromised or lost. Mission scrubs. You are on your own. Nora put the device in her chest pocket, close to her heart, where she would feel it without reaching. 10 minutes to insertion, Hask said. Gear up. Nora pulled on the thermal suppression layer. It was thinner than anything she had worn in 16 weeks of Alaska winter. Designed not to keep warmth in, but to let it out at a controlled rate. So her body registered on scanning equipment as rock, as snow, as the natural cold of the terrain around her. She checked the M200, magazine seated, round chambered, safety on. She checked her hands, steady, heart rate, 58. Slade moved to the door, tested the fast rope anchor. Wind speed at ground level, he said, is 38 knots, gusting to 52. Visibility near 0. You'll have 4 seconds on the rope before the pilot has to climb out. 4 seconds. The door slid open. The cold didn't enter the cabin. It attacked. The temperature inside dropped 20 degrees in 2 seconds. Snow drove horizontal through the opening, and beyond it was nothing but dark and white, and the sound of a storm that had been building for 40 hours and had no interest in stopping. Nora moved to the door and looked down. Shadow 1. Hask's voice behind her. She turned. He was not looking at the tablet. He was looking at her. What you're about to do is not training. It is not an exercise. It is not a test. His glacier eyes held hers without blinking. If you step off this aircraft, you are either returning as someone who completed the mission, or you are not returning at all. Nora turned back to the open door. The darkness waited below her, absolute and patient. I stopped returning the moment I left that barracks, sir. She grabbed the rope and jumped. 4 seconds on the rope. The wind caught her immediately, swinging her body sideways toward the cliff face, with a force that had no interest in negotiation. She squeezed the rope, controlled the pendulum, felt the arc peak and reverse. Her boots hit snow. 3 feet of powder. She sank to her thighs, released the rope, dropped into a crouch. The helicopter was already gone. The sound of rotors lasted 5 seconds after the aircraft disappeared into the blizzard. Then, nothing. Silence so complete it had physical weight. It pressed against her eardrums and filled her chest, and made each heartbeat sound enormous, like something happening in a room much larger than her body. She stayed in her crouch and let the snow settle around her shoulders. Controlled her breathing. In through the nose, 4 seconds. Hold, 4 seconds. Out through the mouth, 8 seconds. Each exhale dispersed instantly in the wind. No vapor cloud, no visible sign of life. She was alone in a way that had no comparison in her previous experience. Not the alone of an empty barracks or a quiet ranch in Wyoming. The alone of a place that would process her remains without ceremony if she made a single significant mistake. She pressed the dead man's switch. Green light. 12-hour timer running. She checked her hands. Steady. Heart rate, 54. She stood, oriented herself by compass, and began moving northeast toward the Harrow Range, toward 18 kilometers of frozen, hostile terrain, and a ridgeline at 10,800 feet where people who knew what they were doing were waiting for someone exactly like her to make a mistake. She did not think about the bus to Anchorage. She did not think about her half-packed duffel, or her father's message, or the rec hall full of people with official futures. She thought about the ground in front of her feet, and the wind against the left side of her face, and the particular quality of the silence between gusts that her father had taught her to read like a language. She moved. The first hour was calculation. Every step required a decision. Weight on the heel or the toe. How deep before the snow crust gave way and broke loud enough to carry. The wind was both enemy and ally at once, covering the sound of her movement, but stealing heat from every exposed surface and testing her balance with gusts that arrived without warning and departed the same way. Her body temperature was dropping. She felt it in stages, the way she had felt it 100 times before on 100 Wyoming hillsides. First the fingers, then the toes, then the face behind the balaclava going numb in the specific way that meant nerve function was retreating to protect the core. She kept moving. Cold was information. Cold was not an emergency yet. The second hour, she smelled them before she saw them. Not literally, but something changed in the quality of the air. A disturbance. The way wind carries a different texture when it has recently passed over human bodies and equipment, and the particular chemical signature of men who have been outside for hours. She dropped flat before the thought was fully formed, became part of the ground in a single motion that her body executed without conscious instruction. She controlled her breathing until her exhaled air dispersed within 6 inches of her face. The patrol appeared 40 meters to her left. 4 men, diamond formation, night vision equipped. Rifles up and forward, not carried, held. The posture of men who expected contact and were prepared to welcome it. They moved with the confidence of people who knew this terrain the way she knew the pastures outside Sheridan. Every step deliberate, every sight line covered. Professional. She pressed her face into the snow and slowed her heart rate. 52, 50, 48. Each beat a conscious choice. Each breath measured in fractions of normal volume. The patrol passed. She waited 3 minutes after the sound of their boots faded. Then 5 more. Then, the thing that separated her from every other trainee she had ever known, she waited 5 additional minutes after she was certain they were gone. Then she moved. The third hour brought a second patrol, this one closer, 20 meters. She heard the crunch of their approach, heard one man cough, heard a brief exchange in low voices. She was lying behind a snowdrift barely high enough to cover her profile. If any of them had turned and looked directly at her position with any real attention, they might have registered the shape that didn't quite belong. None of them looked. They moved on. Nora exhaled a breath she had been holding for 80 seconds. Her lungs burned. Her vision had narrowed slightly from oxygen reduction. She breathed slow and controlled and kept moving. By hour 7, she had covered 12 kilometers. 6 remained between her and the ridge. The mountains were visible now when the wind dropped. Dark masses rising against a sky that had gone from black to the particular deep gray of pre-dawn, in a place where dawn arrived reluctantly and left early. The ridge line above the command post looked like a wall built by something that did not want visitors. Her legs were beginning to lose response time. Not failing, just slowing. The cold was winning the war it always eventually won, conserving the core by withdrawing from the extremities. She kept moving because moving was the only option that mattered. Hour 9, 14 kilometers, 4 to go. And then she heard voices. Not a patrol, something stationary. She dropped and crawled to the edge of a rock outcrop, looked down through her scope at a position 200 meters below her on a steep slope. 3 men, a communications array, a thermal imaging unit mounted on a tripod. They were positioned directly between her and the ridge, covering the approach route she had planned to use. She studied them for 15 minutes. Every 12 minutes, one of the men stepped outside the covered position and ran a slow arc sweep of the surrounding slope with the thermal imager. 40 seconds of scanning, then back inside. 12 minutes, 40 seconds of exposure, then 12 more minutes. Nora looked at her hands. Her fingers were operating at reduced capacity. Her core was holding, but the thermal suppression layer had limits, and she was approaching the outer edge of what physics would allow her body to manage. The scanner was good equipment. At her current core temperature, she was near the threshold of what it could reliably detect. Near the threshold was not the same as below it. She waited for the scan. Watched the guard lift the imager and move it in a slow, practiced arc across the slope above him. 40 seconds. The arc passed across her position. She was motionless, breathing at 1/4 normal volume, heart rate at 46. The guard went back inside. Nora moved, not walking, crawling, completely flat against the snow, arms pulling and legs pushing. A movement so slow it produced no signature of motion on any optical or thermal system. She covered 50 meters in the first cycle. When the guard emerged for the next scan, she was perfectly still again. A slight irregularity in the snow, a shape that could have been a rock, could have been a drift, could have been nothing at all. He scanned. The arc passed over her. He went back inside. She moved again. 50 more meters, then 50 more after that. 3 full cycles. 36 minutes of crawling through snow that found every gap in her gear and pressed cold water against her skin. Her core temperature dropped another degree, then most of another. She cleared the checkpoint. The remaining 2 kilometers took her through terrain that grew steeper and more exposed with every 100 meters of elevation gain. The wind was stronger up here, less directional, bouncing off the rock faces in patterns that made it unpredictable. She moved carefully, testing each foothold before committing weight, reading the snow surface the way her father had taught her to read ice on a frozen creek. At hour 11, the ridge appeared above her, a natural depression in the rock, wind scoured and deep, exactly the kind of position a person who knew what they were doing would have identified from satellite imagery and confirmed on approach. She reached it and slid into it the way water finds a low point, positioned herself face down, extended the M200 forward, cleared snow from the scope with the edge of her glove. The enemy command post was 280 meters below her position. She could see it clearly through the optics. Reinforced structure, communications antenna, generator, thermal shielding on 3 sides, exactly as briefed. 2 guards at the entrance, one on an elevated position to the east, one running a perimeter loop on a 90-minute rotation. She pressed the dead man's switch. 1 press. Green light pulsed. 12-hour timer reset. Then Nora Calloway did the thing she had been doing her entire life without ever having a name for it. She disappeared. Not moved, not hid, disappeared. Let her body temperature equalize with the snow beneath her. Let her heart rate drop to 44. Let her breathing become so shallow and so slow that no instrument she had ever encountered could have distinguished it from the natural movement of wind across a snowfield. She became the ridge, became the rock, became the cold itself. And from that place of absolute stillness, she began to watch. Dawn arrived without color, gray replacing black the way a bruise forms in reverse, slow and without announcement. Nora had been motionless for 3 hours. She had not shifted her position, had not adjusted her grip, had not flexed a single finger. Through the scope, the command post came to life. Guards rotated at exactly 90 minutes, confirming the brief pattern. A supply vehicle arrived from the south at first light, departed within 20 minutes. The communications antenna cycled through what appeared to be a regular satellite uplink sequence at 2-hour intervals. At the second hour, the door to the main structure opened, and a man emerged. Tall, the kind of authority that didn't need to be performed because it had long since become structural. The men around him adjusted without being asked, stepped aside, lowered their angles of attention in the small, unconscious ways that indicated genuine hierarchy rather than the performed kind. He stood outside the entrance for 2 minutes, hands clasped behind his back, scanning the ridgeline above his position with the patience of someone who believed the threat was real and was simply waiting for it to confirm itself. Viper. Nora memorized everything. His gait when he finally moved, the slight forward lean that suggested an old lower back injury never fully resolved. The way he held his left hand slightly behind his hip when he walked, a habit or an old wound. The way he paused at the door on his way back inside and looked up at the ridge one final time before stepping through. He knew someone was coming. He had always known someone was coming. She cataloged the patrol patterns, confirmed the 90-minute rotation, noted 2 variations in the route that suggested the guards were not operating from a fixed schedule, but from a flexible one with built-in randomization. Smart, harder to predict, harder to plan around. She noted the communication timing, the supply approach vector, the guard positioning relative to the thermal shielding. She noted all of it. And then at the 7th hour of her observation, she felt something that made her blood, already cold, go colder. She was being watched. Not by a patrol, not by a guard running a perimeter check, by something patient, something skilled, something that had been in position longer than she had and was conducting its own observation of the same terrain she occupied, with the methodical discipline of a professional who had done this many times before and found the patience for it. Nora did not move, did not react, did not change her breathing or her heart rate or the angle of her body by a single degree. But behind the scope, her eyes began a slow and careful sweep of the terrain across the valley. The valley was wide, a natural bowl between 2 ridgelines, the far wall rising to its own crest line at a distance that made the air between them feel like a physical obstacle. 3,200 meters across open ground, rocky, broken, multiple natural concealment options for someone who knew what they were doing. She looked at each one, looked past the obvious positions first, the ones that offered the best fields of fire, the best cover, the best angles. A trained operator would take those. She was looking for something different. She was looking for the position that offered not the best option, but the least expected one. The kind of place a person chose when they understood that the enemy was also looking for the best position and had already prepared for it. There, 3,200 meters across the valley, a shape in the rocks that was almost perfect, almost natural. The snow accumulation pattern was 95% consistent with the surrounding terrain. The shadows fell correctly. The profile fit, but not quite. The snow on one specific surface was 2 degrees smoother than the surrounding drift patterns, which meant it had been disturbed and then repacked by hands rather than wind. The smoothness wasn't visible at a glance. It was visible after 7 hours of lying still and staring at the same terrain until you knew it the way you knew your own reflection. A sniper, positioned to overwatch the command post, positioned to kill anyone who came to do exactly what she was doing. Nora's heart rate ticked upward. 50, 52. She brought it back down. If he had seen her, she would already be dead. That much was certain. She was still breathing, which meant his scan had passed over her position and found nothing, which meant she had some time. A window, narrow and temporary, but real. She pressed the dead man's switch first. One press. Green light pulsed. Timer reset. Hask would know she was still operational. Then she keyed her radio. Shadow 1 to Overwatch. I have a secondary contact, Far Ridge, approximately 3,200 meters. Request confirmation. Hask's voice came back within 15 seconds. Shadow 1, describe the position. She gave him the coordinates, the terrain features, the specific surface anomaly she had identified. A pause, longer than the previous ones. Then, that is Rook. She waited. Hask's voice dropped half a register. Every operator we sent into that valley was detected within 6 hours. We attributed it to thermal scanning, to signature management failures, to the quality of their equipment. He paused again. We were wrong about the mechanism. It wasn't the thermal systems finding them. It was Rook reading their patterns. The way they moved, the positions they chose, the angles they preferred. He's been doing this for 11 years. He knows how trained operators think because he learned from the same sources they did. Nora said nothing, processing. He controls the entire valley, Hask continued. Every approach, every withdrawal, every line of sight to that command post runs through the terrain he's watching. As long as he's in that position, no one reaches Viper. She understood what he was telling her without him having to complete the sentence. She couldn't complete the primary mission while Rook remained operational. He was not the listed objective. He was the reason the listed objective had survived every previous attempt. Removing him was not secondary, it was foundational. But the geometry was almost impossible to articulate. 3,200 meters across an open valley, a crosswind that had been running between 35 and 50 knots all morning with no predictable low. Uphill angle, subsonic ammunition with significant drop at extended range. A target she had identified, not through his movement, but through a 2-degree anomaly in snowpack texture. Every ballistics calculation she had ever been taught said, no. She keyed the radio one more time. Understood, Overwatch, going dark. She returned her attention to the position across the valley, and she began to wait. Not impatiently, not with the tight, controlled waiting of someone managing anxiety, the deep, organic waiting of a person who understood that time was not the enemy here. Time was the instrument. Every hour she spent watching Rook was an hour of data. Every observation was a piece of the pattern, and pattern was the only thing that mattered now. He moved on a 40-minute cycle, a micro-adjustment, a slight shift in the scope angle, a disciplined sweep of terrain sectors that followed the same sequence each time. Textbook. The kind of technique taught in advanced schools by instructors who had spent years distilling best practice into replicable process. Textbook was predictable. And predictable, her father had told her once, while they were lying on a frozen hillside, watching a bull elk work his way through a draw 300 yards below them, was just another word for readable. Find the rhythm, Earl had said. Every living thing has one. Find it and you own the moment between beats. She watched Rook's rhythm for 6 hours. During those 6 hours, she also listened to the wind. Not the way a ballistics course taught you to listen to wind, measuring it, quantifying it, entering values into a formula. The way her father had taught her to listen to it on the Bighorn Mountains at age 11. Lying beside him in the snow with nothing between them and the far ridgeline but cold air and distance. Wind has a heartbeat, Earl would say. same as everything else. You can feel it before it arrives if you're paying attention to the right things. The pressure change, the way the snow surface shifts a half second before the gust hits, the sound frequency dropping in the trees below you just before the next pulse comes through. She had spent 11 years learning to read that frequency without knowing it had a practical application beyond the ranch. Now she knew. The wind over the Harrow Range ran in a complex pattern, influenced by the valley geometry, the ridgeline shapes, the temperature differential between the lower terrain and the upper elevations. It was not random. Nothing was ever truly random. It had a structure, and the structure had a cycle, and the cycle had a low point. 23 minutes between peak gusts. At the low point, the wind dropped from its sustained 40-plus knots to something between 10 and 15 for a window of approximately 4 seconds before the next pulse began building. 4 seconds. The same amount of time she had been given on the fast rope descending into this valley 14 hours ago. She began tracking the low points, counting the seconds, feeling the pressure change in the air against her face, feeling the micro shift in the snow surface around her body that preceded each drop. After 2 hours of tracking, she could predict the low point within a 1-second margin. After 3 hours, she was consistently accurate to half a second. She was not going to calculate this shot. Calculation required variables she could not accurately determine from this position. Exact wind velocity at the midpoint of the trajectory, precise air density at 11,000 feet, the exact weight of the subsonic load against the environmental conditions at this specific moment. The numbers would not give her what she needed. The numbers would give her a probability, and the probability would tell her the shot was not viable. She was not going to take the shot that the numbers said was viable. She was going to take the shot that she had spent 30 years of combined experience between herself and her father learning to feel. She settled into the M200. Let it become part of her body the way the rifle on the ranch had always become part of her body when she was still enough and patient enough. She placed the crosshairs on the space across the valley, not on Rook's position, on the space in the air between her barrel and his position where the bullet needed to arrive after wind and gravity and distance had their full say. A point that existed not in the physical landscape, but in her understanding of it. She waited for the 40-minute mark in his cycle, the point at which his scope would be at its swept position, not actively searching her sector, committed to the far edge of his arc. She waited for the wind to begin its pre-low pressure shift. She felt it, the fractional drop in the air against her left cheek, the slight settling of the snow surface, the almost imperceptible change in the background frequency of the wind through the rocks below her. The gust cycle was in its final seconds. Nora's heart rate dropped to 42. Her breathing stopped on the exhale. The wind fell. 12 knots. 10. The valley went as close to still as it was going to get. She fired. The M200 kicked against her shoulder with the controlled authority of a weapon that knew its purpose. The suppressor reduced the report to something no louder than a book falling from a shelf onto a hard floor. The subsonic round left the barrel and entered the cold air of the Harrow Range Valley and began its long conversation with gravity and distance and the remnant crosswind that was already rebuilding behind it. 3,200 meters. The bullet climbed, arced, fell. Through the scope, she watched the position across the valley where the snowpack texture had been 2 degrees too smooth. It erupted. Snow and rock fragments displaced outward in the specific violent way that meant impact, not wind, not settling. The shape that had been almost natural became suddenly and completely unnatural. The careful geometry of a concealed position, destroyed in a fraction of a second by a projectile that no simulation program in the world would have confirmed as viable. Direct hit. For exactly 4 seconds, the valley was silent. Nora allowed herself one full breath, one single measured exhale. Not relief, not celebration, something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of a person who has just done something that cannot be undone and has not yet fully processed what that means. Then the world came apart. The first mortar round hit 35 meters below her position. The concussion reached her before the sound did, a pressure wave that compressed her chest and made her ears ring with a high, clean tone. Snow cascaded from above, burying the scope. She cleared the lens with one motion and looked down. The command post had erupted into organized activity, not panic, directed, coordinated response. Men taking positions they had clearly rehearsed, someone issuing commands in a tone that carried authority without urgency. And behind the main structure, a mortar team she had not identified in her observation hours was adjusting their tube with the practiced speed of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. They had pre-sighted the ridge. Every viable sniper position on the high ground above the command post had been mapped and targeted before she ever arrived. The muzzle flash from the M200, barely a flicker even with suppression, had been enough. They had triangulated her location in seconds. The second round hit 22 meters above her. Closer. Rock fragments rained down across her position. She felt a piece of shrapnel impact her left shoulder, the hard, blunt force of it through her gear. No penetration, but the bracketing was clear. One short, one long. The third round would split the difference. She grabbed the M200 and moved. Not thought, not decision. The part of the brain that exists below decision-making, the ancient operational layer that processes threat and generates response without waiting for conscious approval, put her in motion before the intellectual understanding of the situation had fully formed. She rolled out of the depression, got her feet under her, and threw herself over the crest of the ridge as the third mortar round hit her position with a precision that would have killed her if she had still been there. The blast wave caught her in the air. It picked her up the way a hand picks up a piece of paper without consideration and threw her. She hit the backside of the ridge on her left side, hip first, then ribs, then shoulder, then the side of her head against rock that had no interest in softening the contact. She slid 20 feet down loose scree before her hands found something solid and stopped her. She lay still for 2 seconds, assessing. Rifle still in her grip. She had held it through the blast, through the impact, through the slide down the rock face, her hands locked around it by a mechanism that operated below voluntary control. She ran a rapid inventory. Left hip, bruised. Left ribs, possibly cracked. Breathing was restricted but not absent. Left shoulder, the shrapnel impact site, painful but functional. Head, ringing, vision slightly narrowed but clearing. Left leg, she sent a signal to her left leg and received back something that was not pain in the conventional sense. It was white. A white that started at the knee and traveled the full length of her nervous system and arrived in her brain not as sensation, but as a statement of fact. Something structural had failed in the fall. The joint felt loose in a way that joints were not designed to feel loose. Cartilage moving where cartilage had no business moving. She pressed the dead man's switch. One press. Green light pulsed. Timer reset. Then she keyed the radio. Shadow 1 to Overwatch. Compromised. Taking indirect fire. Position destroyed. Hask's voice came back within seconds. He sounded exactly the same as he had in the barracks at Fort Caldwell. Calm in the way that very specific training produces. The kind of calm that is not the absence of urgency, but the management of it. Shadow 1, status. Position destroyed by pre-sighted mortar response. 15 seconds from shot to first impact. They had the ridge mapped. Did you engage Rook? Engaged and confirmed, sir. A pause that lasted 3 full seconds, which in Hask's communication pattern was the equivalent of a long silence. You confirmed Rook at 3,200 meters. Subsonic load. In those conditions. Yes, sir. Another pause. Can you move? She put weight on her left leg. The white came back, sharper this time, and her vision briefly narrowed at the edges. The joint held, but the sensation it sent back was unambiguous about what it thought of the situation. Mobility is compromised, Left leg is damaged. How damaged? Structural, sir. The joint is unstable. I'm moving but not at speed. Secondary extraction point, 18 kilometers northwest. Coordinates are in your GPS. You have 14 hours before the weather window closes. Copy, sir. Shadow 1. Hask's voice dropped to the register she had heard only once before, in the barracks doorway when he had looked at her one final time before stepping into the storm. There was something in it that was not warmth but was adjacent to it, the acknowledgement of one person to another that what was being asked was not a small thing. If you can't make it, press the switch. We'll know. And then what, sir? And then you are on your own. The radio went silent. Nora lay on the rock face for 10 additional seconds, not resting, processing, doing the arithmetic that the situation required. 18 kilometers, 14 hours, that was 1.3 kilometers per hour. A person walking casually on flat ground covered 5. A trained operator in difficult terrain managed 2. She needed 1.3 on a leg that was providing ongoing editorial commentary about the structural limitations of continuing. The math worked. Barely. But barely was not nothing. She stood. The first step was the worst. Not because of the pain, though the pain was significant, but because of the sound. A grinding she felt through the bone before she heard it in the air, cartilage shifting where it had no business shifting. The sound of a system operating outside its design parameters. She took the second step, then the third. Behind her, she could hear the mortar team adjusting their targeting. They knew the third round had hit the position. They were not certain it had been fatal. A search patrol would be moving within minutes. Nora began the 18 kilometers. She moved down the backside of the ridge into terrain she had not scouted, territory she had not planned for. Every step a negotiation between what she needed and what her body was willing to provide. The snow could support her weight or give way without warning. The rock beneath could be solid or rotted with ice that would crumble under pressure. She fell twice in the first 100 meters, got up both times. On the second fall, her left knee buckled completely and she went face first into snow deep enough to cover her head. For 3 seconds, she was buried, blind, the snow pressing against her face with a cold and indifferent intimacy. She clawed out, found air, kept moving. The math of forward progress reduced to its irreducible components. 1 foot, then the other. The grinding in her knee a constant background presence, like static between stations. Present enough to register, not loud enough to demand a response she couldn't provide. She thought about her father in Wyoming, sitting at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold, waiting for her call. She thought about 41 people who had not come home. She kept moving. An hour into the extraction, she heard boots behind her, a patrol sent to confirm the kill, moving fast and professional through terrain they knew. She found a crevasse in the rock face, barely wider than her shoulders, lowered herself in, pulled snow over her head. A boot stepped onto the snow directly above her. The weight compressed the snow against her face. She could not breathe. The boot stayed. 5 seconds. 10. 15. She could feel the vibration of the man's weight shifting as he turned, using the crevasse as a stepping stone to get elevation for a better view of the slope below. 20 seconds. 25. Her vision began to develop edges. The boot lifted. Nora did not breathe for another 30 seconds. When she finally inhaled, she did it so slowly that the air entering her lungs made no sound at all. She waited 10 more minutes before she moved. Then she pulled herself out of the crevasse and continued northwest. 17 kilometers remaining, 13 hours on the clock. The mountain had tried everything it had. She was still moving. Kilometer 11 was where her knee stopped being a knee. Not gradually, not with warning. The joint simply reached the end of what physics and biology and sheer stubbornness could sustain together, and it quit. Mid-stride, full weight forward, no warning at all. She went down hard, hit the ground on her right side, slid 3 meters on ice before a boulder stopped her with a blunt indifference of the mountain, expressing its opinion of the whole situation. She lay there breathing, heart rate 88, the highest it had been since the insertion drop, her body telling her something in the clearest language it possessed. Done. Finished. Stop. She looked at her leg. The knee was no longer simply swollen. The geometry of it was wrong. The joint had shifted, not dramatically, not the grotesque displacement of a complete dislocation, but enough that the outline of it through her gear described a shape that knees were not designed to describe. Something structural had given way completely. The temporary workaround she had been using for the last 3 hours, the compensatory movement pattern that routed weight through her hip and shifted her gait enough to keep forward progress going, had finally exceeded what the remaining architecture could support. She sat up, took the strap from her rifle sling, and wrapped it around the knee, pulling it tight enough that her vision went white at the edges for 2 full seconds. Found a flat rock, smooth enough, wedged it against the outside of the joint as a crude lateral splint. Tightened the strap another increment. The white came back. She breathed through it, tested the splint, put partial weight on it. It held, barely, with a grinding quality that she filed under information rather than crisis, because crisis was a category she could not afford at kilometer 11, with 7 remaining, and pursuit elements somewhere behind her in the dark. She stood on one leg, then transferred weight to the splinted knee with the deliberate care of a person diffusing something. It held. She moved. At kilometer 13, the helicopter found her. She heard the rotors before she saw it, the sound coming from the east and moving fast, low enough that it was using the valley terrain for cover. Not a transport, something smaller, more purposeful, and the sensor pod mounted beneath its nose confirmed what she already suspected. Thermal imaging. Active sweep. They had not found her boot prints in the darkness, so they had called in air assets to do the work that ground teams couldn't. She went flat, pressed herself into a shallow depression between 2 rocks, an inadequate hide by any trained assessment, the kind of position that would have failed her on any qualification exercise she had ever run. But she was not trying to pass a qualification exercise. She was trying to become rock. She slowed her heart rate, 48, 46, slowed her breathing to the threshold of measurable. Let the cold that had been working against her for 11 hours become the thing that kept her alive. Her body temperature dropping to the point where the differential between her surface and the surrounding snow was too small for the sensor pod to confidently distinguish. The helicopter passed overhead and kept going. She stayed flat. It came back. Tighter circle this time. The pilot was good, working a systematic search pattern with the discipline of someone who had done this before and understood that patience was the variable that determined outcome. The sensor pod moved in small, deliberate increments, scanning the terrain below in overlapping arcs that left no significant gap. The aircraft slowed, began to descend. 250 meters above her position, the rotor downwash blasting snow in every direction, creating a localized whiteout that was simultaneously covering her tracks and threatening to reveal her position through the disturbance pattern it created around her body. The sensor pod pointed directly down, directly at her. She pressed the dead man's switch. One press, green light pulsed, 12-hour timer reset. At minimum, Hask would know she was still alive. The helicopter held its position. 30 seconds. 45. A full minute. The sensor pod moved in its small increments, searching, adjusting, refusing to accept a null result. Then the aircraft began to descend further. They were going to put boots on the ground. The thermal scan had not confirmed a target, but someone on that aircraft, someone with enough experience and enough professional skepticism, had decided that a negative result from a sensor was not the same as a confirmed clear area. They were going to check physically. It was exactly what she would have done. She had 12 rounds left in the M200. She had the geometry of the situation. She had the specific vulnerability of a helicopter in the process of maneuvering for a landing approach. When the tail rotor assembly swings through an exposure arc that lasts approximately 2 to 3 seconds before the aircraft completes its turn and the angle closes. She did not think about it in those terms. She simply watched the helicopter bank slightly to position itself for descent, saw the tail rotor assembly swing through its exposure arc against the dark sky 250 meters above her, and her body moved with the complete autonomy of a system that had been designed for this moment and did not require instruction. Rifle up, scope to eye. The tail rotor housing finding the crosshairs in the fraction of a second between intention and action. She fired. The round traveled upward through 250 meters of vertical space that every training manual would have classified as an impossible engagement geometry. The crosswind at altitude should have carried it wide. The upward angle should have compromised the ballistic solution beyond recovery. The subsonic load should not have retained sufficient energy at that range. The round entered the tail rotor housing. Metal shattered against metal with the specific, catastrophic sound of a precision system meeting sudden, catastrophic input. The tail rotor seized. The helicopter did not explode. What it did was stop being a controlled aircraft and start being a falling object with spinning components. A transition that the pilot fought with everything available to him. He was good. He converted the uncontrolled yaw into a managed descent, trading altitude for lateral control, bringing the aircraft down in a spiral that was survivable rather than terminal. The skids hit the ground 500 meters to the east with a force that buckled them but did not roll the aircraft. The rotor blades chewed into snow and rock and stopped. The crew was alive, which meant they were already climbing out, already on the radio, already organizing a pursuit with the professional speed of people who had just been shot down and had no intention of accepting that outcome without response. Nora was already moving. Stealth was a closed account. She had spent the balance of it on 18 hours of invisible movement and one tail rotor. What remained was speed, and speed on a splinted knee with 7 kilometers between her and the extraction point was a negotiation rather than a solution. But it was the only negotiation available. She ran, or what her body was currently able to produce under the heading of running. Each impact sending a signal up through the joint and the long bones in the spine that arrived in her brain as a sustained declaration of structural objection. She registered it and continued. Behind her, she could hear the down crew organizing, voices sharp and directed, the sound of people who were angry and professional and moving in her direction with purpose. At kilometer 14, she heard a second patrol converging from the north. They were moving fast on terrain they knew, cutting angles she would not have thought to cut. She found something in the next kilometer that she could not have named precisely, but that her father had described once on a hillside in Wyoming when she was 16 and had asked him how he kept moving during a particularly brutal late-season hunt after a fall that had bruised 3 ribs. He had thought about it for a long time before answering. "There's a place past the pain," he had said finally, "past the point where the body is done arguing with you and just starts doing what you tell it. It's not comfortable, it's not easy, but it's there. And once you find it, you understand that the body was never the limiting factor. It was always something else. She found it at kilometer 14. The pain did not go away. The grinding did not stop. The joint did not become structurally sound. But the negotiation ended. Her body stopped filing objections and started executing instructions, and she moved through the remaining terrain with a kind of clarity that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with the absolute reduction of existence to a single operational requirement. Forward, northwest, the extraction point. The false landing zone appeared below her at kilometer 15, an open clearing of exactly the type that extraction planning doctrine specified, exactly the type that an enemy intelligence analyst would have identified and prepared for. She remembered Hask's briefing, The detail he had included without explaining why he was including it. The note about the secondary extraction point being offset from the obvious position. She turned east, moved through broken rock for 100 meters, found the cliff face. The anchor bolt was there, drilled into the rock at chest height, almost invisible against the dark stone. The kind of hardware that had been placed by someone who understood that the best infrastructure was the kind that looked like it didn't exist. Nora set her back against the cliff face, established her field of fire across the false landing zone, and ran a weapons check. M200, 2 magazines, 12 rounds total. She keyed the radio. Shadow 1 to Overwatch. At secondary extraction point. Anchor confirmed. Hask's response was immediate. He had been waiting. Shadow 1, status. Left leg is non-functional, sir. I am not walking out of here under my own power. She paused. The LZ is going to be hot. I have at least 2 pursuit elements converging. One from the east, one from the south-southeast. Estimate 6 to 8 personnel total. Can you hold? She looked at her 2 magazines, looked at the tree line beyond the false clearing where the first pursuit element would emerge. 8 minutes, sir. Bird is spinning up. 8 minutes. His voice dropped to the register she had heard twice before. Don't die, Shadow 1. The radio went silent. 8 minutes. 480 seconds. She started counting. At 112 seconds, the first pursuit element broke from the tree line. 4 men, moving fast toward the clearing, covering each other with the practiced geometry of a team that had trained together long enough to operate without verbal coordination. They were heading directly for the obvious extraction point, committing to the open ground with the confidence of people who had been told where she was going. Nora let them enter the clearing, let them commit their full weight to the open space. Then she fired. First round, the lead man, shoulder hit. He went down spinning. The remaining 3 scattered immediately. Trained response. No hesitation, moving toward the nearest cover. And 2 of them moved toward cover that put them 30 meters closer to her actual position. She shifted. Second round, the nearer of the 2, hit. He dropped behind a boulder and stopped moving. Return fire came from the other 2, muzzle flashes in the dark at 40 meters. Rounds cracking against the cliff face above her head, rock fragments showering down across her shoulders and the back of her neck. She pressed into the stone and made herself as small as the geometry of her position allowed. Third round, miss. The wind gusted at the precise wrong moment, the kind of timing that had no malice in it but felt personal anyway. She breathed, reset. Fourth round, the man behind the boulder on the left. He stopped returning fire. The second pursuit element arrived from the south. Larger. She counted muzzle flashes in the darkness and reached a number that was higher than the rounds she had remaining. Shadow 1, Overwatch. Bird is 3 minutes out. She had 8 rounds left. She had more than 8 targets. The arithmetic was what it was. She stopped thinking about the arithmetic. Each trigger pull was a conversation between her finger and the rifle, between the rifle and the wind, between the wind and the bullet, and the specific point in space where the bullet needed to arrive. She was not managing a firefight. She was solving a sequence of individual problems, one at a time, with the rounds she had, in the order the situation presented them. Fifth round, hit. Sixth round, hit. Seventh round, the wind again, miss. She registered the miss, adjusted her understanding of what the wind was doing at this specific moment, incorporated the information. Eighth round, hit. Return fire had intensified to the point where the rock face above her was receiving near continuous impact, chips of stone falling across her like rough precipitation. She blinked debris from her eyes, kept the scope to her eye, kept working. 9th, 10th, 11th. 1 round remaining. She heard the rotors before she saw the aircraft, coming in low and fast from the north. Not a Black Hawk, something smaller and more agile. Running dark, no lights, moving with the specific urgency of a pilot who had been given a time constraint and intended to meet it. Shadow 1, we have visual on your position. Fast rope deploying in 20 seconds. She had 1 round. She had multiple active enemy personnel. She had 20 seconds. She chose her round carefully. The man who presented the clearest threat to the incoming aircraft, positioned in the tree line at the northern edge of the clearing, with an angle that would put the extraction helicopter in his field of fire during the descent. She fired. He dropped. The fast rope hit the ground beside her 2 seconds later. Nora grabbed it with hands that had been locked in a firing grip for the better part of 20 hours and discovered that the same mechanism that had kept her holding the rifle through a mortar blast and a fall down a rock face was still operational. Her grip closed around the rope with a strength that had nothing to do with what her muscles could voluntarily produce at this point in the proceedings. She clipped her harness to the line. "Go," she said into the radio. Her voice came out even. She noted that distantly. "Go now." The helicopter surged upward. The rope went taut with a force that traveled through the harness and through her body and arrived in her damaged knee as the most comprehensive statement the joint had made in the entire 14-hour running conversation they had been having. Her boots left the ground as rounds tore through the space she had occupied 1 second before. The cliff face blurred past. The wind hit her from every direction simultaneously. She spun on the rope, watching the ground fall away, watching muzzle flashes wink like small, cold stars in the darkness below, watching the false landing zone and the rock faces and the anchor bolt in the place where she had held for 8 minutes with 12 rounds become small, and then smaller, and then gone. The helicopter cleared the ridgeline. The firing stopped. The aircraft banked hard north and accelerated, and the Harrow Range, the valley, the command post, the 3,200 meters of cold air that the ballistics program said could not be crossed, fell away behind her into the dark. Nora hung on the rope and looked down at the mountains. At the place that had tried its absolute best, heart rate 64, steady, she was still breathing. They pulled her into the cabin at altitude. 2 crew members grabbed her harness and hauled her over the threshold with the careful efficiency of people who had done this before and understood that the person coming in on the rope had usually spent everything they had getting to the rope in the first place. She hit the deck. Her left leg folded in the direction legs were not designed to fold, and the white came back in a full coverage flood that removed her vision entirely for approximately 2 seconds. Someone called for a medic. Hands on her, cutting away the makeshift splint, removing the boot with a care that still registered as violence given the current state of the joint underneath. She gripped the cargo netting above her head and focused on a specific point on the ceiling of the aircraft. "Tibial plateau fracture," the medic said. His voice had the compressed quality of a man working quickly. "ACL, complete rupture. MCL, partial. Significant capsular damage throughout the joint." He looked at her in a way that contained a question he was deciding whether to ask. "How long were you mobile after this occurred?" "Approximately 14 hours, she said. "On foot?" "Yes." He looked at the splint he had just removed, the flat rock still wrapped in the rifle sling. He looked at her face. He did not say anything else. He began working. Colonel Hask was sitting across the cabin. She had not seen him when they pulled her in. He was simply there, the way he had been simply there in the barracks doorway at Fort Caldwell, present without announcement, watching with those pale, precise eyes that registered everything and committed to nothing. He waited until the medic had stabilized the leg, until the IV line was running, until the shaking in her hands, not cold this time, but the particular deep tremor of an adrenaline system completing its discharge, had reduced from active shaking to a residual vibration. Then he reached under his seat and produced a thermos, held it toward her. She took it, unscrewed the cap with fingers that cooperated approximately 60% of the way and required the other 40% to be covered by determination. The heat hit her palms first, then moved up through her wrists, and when she drank, the warmth traveled through her chest in a way that was almost aggressive after the hours of cold. "Did I complete the mission, sir?" Hask pulled out his tablet, turned it toward her. The satellite imagery showed the command post from directly above. But the image was different from the one she had studied in the briefing. The organized patterns she had observed for 18 hours, the predictable rotations, and the disciplined positioning was gone. What she was looking at was dispersal. Vehicles departing at speed in multiple directions. Personnel moving without the geometric coordination of a functioning command structure. "The man you identified as Rook," Hask said. "Do you know who he was?" "You told me his name was James Whitfield, sir." "Yes," he looked at the image. "What I didn't tell you in the briefing is what he was. Whitfield wasn't simply a counter-sniper. He was the field intelligence coordinator for the entire regional network. Every piece of information moving through this area passed through him. Every patrol route, every communication protocol, every supply line. He was the nervous system of the operation." Nora looked at the dispersing activity on the screen. "When you removed him," Hask continued, "you didn't eliminate a single operator. You severed the central coordination function of everything they have been building in this region for 3 years." He zoomed the image out. "Those vehicles you see departing are not executing a tactical withdrawal. That is an organization that has lost the ability to coordinate and is reverting to individual survival behavior." He opened a wider view. Blue markers moving through terrain that had been marked as denied on every operational map she had seen during her 16 weeks of training. 3 Allied units are currently advancing through corridors that were impassable 48 hours ago. The weapons pipeline that killed 41 people is being physically dismantled as we speak. He put the tablet away. "You gave us a 72-hour window that we have been trying to create for 7 months. Nora looked at the blue markers, each one representing people moving safely through ground she had opened by lying in the snow and refusing to stop. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You knew who Whitfield was when you came to Fort Caldwell, sir?" Hask looked at her. Not a question. "No," he said, "it wasn't." "You knew he was my father's spotter?" "Yes." "You knew Earl had been looking for him for 11 years?" "Yes." The cabin was quiet except for the engine and the wind outside and the medic moving equipment in the forward section. Nora looked at the thermos in her hands. "You didn't choose me only because of the thermal signature." Hask was quiet for a long moment, the kind of pause that indicated genuine consideration rather than the construction of a deflection. "No," he said, "not only." She waited. Rook had been in that valley for 14 months. In that time, 3 separate teams had attempted to reach the command post. All 3 were detected and neutralized within hours of insertion. We analyzed the failures looking for the common variable. The conclusion was thermal signature management. We were wrong. He paused. The common variable was pattern, how trained operators move, how they select positions, how they breathe and wait and decide. Rook had been trained in the same schools, by the same doctrine, as every operator we sent against him. He could read them the way a chess player reads an opponent who learned from the same teacher. She understood where this was going. "But I didn't learn from those schools. You learned from Earl Calloway, who learned from James Whitfield." Hask's voice was precisely level. "The way you move through terrain, the way you select concealment, the way you manage stillness and cold, it doesn't match any trained pattern Rook would have been scanning for. You move like Earl moves, and Earl moves like Whitfield taught him to move. Rook would not have recognized his own methodology being used against him, because he taught Earl before he disappeared. Yes, and you needed someone he couldn't read." "Yes." Nora held the thermos. "You should have told me, sir." "Yes," he said, "I should have. No qualification, no explanation, no balancing argument to mitigate the admission, just the acknowledgement, delivered in the same even tone as everything else he said, which somehow made it more significant than if he had made a performance of it. I needed you to move without knowing what you were moving toward. Hask continued after a moment. If I had told you that the counter-sniper across the valley was your father's missing partner, the man Earl spent 11 years trying to find, you would have approached that ridgeline carrying that information. It would have changed something in how you moved, how you waited, how you made the decision you made. Nora looked at the tablet, at the dispersing heat signatures, at the blue markers moving through corridors she had opened. You needed me to not know. I needed you to be exactly what you were, which was someone who had never been trained to be anything other than what you naturally are. He paused. I am sorry that the cost of that was not having the full truth. She sat with that for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been forming since he had said Whitfield's name on the radio 14 hours ago. Was he waiting to be found, sir? Or had he made a choice? Hask was quiet for a long time. He made several choices over the course of 11 years. His voice was careful in a way it had not been before. The last one, I believe, was made sometime before tonight. She nodded. She needed to call her father. The medical facility was aggressive in its warmth. After 26 hours in sub-zero conditions, the interior temperature registered against her skin as something close to physical assault. Her fingers throbbed as circulation returned to capillaries that had closed down to protect her core, and she sat on the edge of the examination table while Dr. Wexler reviewed the imaging and delivered his assessment in the measured cadence of a physician who had spent his career treating injuries sustained by people doing things that were not officially recorded. The surgical repair was scheduled for the following morning. Recovery timeline, 6 to 8 weeks minimum. Physical therapy to follow. He gave her the information with the professional neutrality of someone who had delivered similar assessments to similar people and understood that the response would be compliance in the immediate term and renegotiation in the medium term. She was moved to a recovery room at 2100. Small, clean, a single window looking out onto a training compound she had never seen in any published material. She sat on the bunk with her leg elevated and her phone in her hand. She looked at it for a long time before she dialed. Earl answered on the second ring. It was late in Wyoming. He would have been awake anyway. Nora, his voice. She had not heard it in 16 weeks, and it arrived in her chest with a force that had nothing to do with volume. Dad. She stopped. Organized what she was going to say. There were rules about what she could tell him, and she intended to honor those rules, and also to give him what he needed within them. Those two things were not in conflict, she had decided. They simply required care. I need to tell you something about Whitfield. The silence on the other end of the line had a quality she had never heard from him before. Not the considered silence of a man thinking, the held-breath silence of a man who had been waiting 11 years for a sentence to complete itself. James, she said, I have information, Dad. I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you what matters. How do you know anything about James? Because I was there at the end. Another silence, longer. Was he? He was not waiting to be found, she said. He had made a choice. A long time before the end, and the end itself was his. It wasn't done to him. She heard her father's breathing change. He didn't suffer, she said, and he knew what he was doing. How do you know that? Because of how still he was, she said, and because of how patient. The silence this time was different. She could feel something shifting in it, the way she could feel the pressure change before a wind drop. The way the air moved differently when a long-held weight began its descent toward the ground. Earl Calloway cried. She had not heard him cry since the November when she was 7 years old and they drove home from a hospital in silence. She sat on the bunk in a facility that did not appear on any map and listened to her father mourn the person he had been looking for since before she was old enough to understand what looking cost. And she understood that this was why she could continue. Not the mission, not the blue markers on a satellite display, this specific moment, this specific thing she had been able to give him, enough truth to let go. She stayed on the call until his breathing steadied, told him she was safe, told him she had a training injury, that she was recovering, that she would call again when she could. He asked her if she was all right, the way he always asked, meaning several things at once, the way parents ask questions that contain more than they can directly say. "I'm all right, Dad," she said. "I know what I'm doing now." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have been impossible to live with about this," he said finally. "She would have told everyone." Nora laughed. The sound surprised her. Genuine and unplanned, the kind of laugh that arrives from somewhere below the level of intention. "I know," she said. She sat with the phone after the call ended, looking at the window, at the training compound outside where lights were still on in several of the structures. The compound that existed in the gap between official records and operational reality, where the work that kept the blue markers moving happened without acknowledgement or ceremony. Dalloway came at 2200. She heard his knock, heavy and direct. She told him to come in. He stood in the doorway. He did not sit. He was holding something, a small patch, black fabric, a single white horizontal line through the center. He looked at her leg, at the surgical wrap, at the IV line still running, then at her face. Morgan. He used her name, not her rank, not the designation that had been stripped from her at the firing line at Fort Caldwell. Just the name. "I owe you something." She waited. "I said you hadn't finished basic, that you were untested." He turned the patch over in his hands. "I was measuring you by the only scale I knew." He stopped, started again, more carefully. "I have spent 14 years in this work. I have stood next to operators who had every qualification this organization can confer, and watched them make decisions under pressure that I would not have made." He looked at her directly. "And I have never, in 14 years, seen what I watched on that mission feed tonight." She said nothing. Not the shot. He shook his head slightly, "Though that is something I will be thinking about for a long time. The 14 kilometers on that leg." He set the patch on the bed beside her hand. "That was something else." "What is it?" she asked. "Not official. Nothing we do is official. The line represents the space between visible and invisible, the operational space. When someone completes their first mission with this unit, they receive one." She picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. "There's something else," Dalloway said. He did not sit, but the way he was standing had changed. Something in his posture releasing an architecture that had been load-bearing since the firing line at Fort Caldwell. When the debrief team analyzed the Rook engagement, they ran the shot through 3 separate ballistic modeling programs, and all 3 returned the same result. She waited. "Impossible." He said the word without inflection, just the word itself carrying its own weight. Literally, the modeling software could not reproduce the trajectory. Wind conditions, range, ammunition type, target geometry. The simulation said the bullet could not reach the target. He looked at her. But it did. He left without ceremony. She sat for a long time after that, the patch in one hand, the phone in the other. Her father's voice still present in her chest, the way warmth is present after cold. Not as a sensation anymore, but as a memory of sensation. A residue that changes the quality of everything that comes after it. Hask came at 2300. He did not knock. He stood in the doorway the way he had stood in the doorway at Fort Caldwell, and he looked at her with those glacier eyes that saw the same things they had always seen, and revealed the same nothing they had always revealed. He crossed the room and placed the dead man's switch on the bed beside the patch. "Keep it," she said. "It's not standard issue." He stepped back. "But I want you to remember something. Every check-in, out in those hills with a broken leg and 1 round left, you press that switch. Every 12 hours. You never missed. I told you I would complete the mission." "You completed more than the mission," he said. He moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame, the same pause he had used in the barracks at Fort Caldwell before the line about standards, as if he were a man who returned to the same doorways at the same moments when he had something true to say. The instructors at Fort Caldwell were right, Calloway. You don't meet their standards. She looked at him. The same words, different weight. The weight of everything that had happened between the first time he said them and now. You exceed them in ways their tests were not designed to measure. He looked at her one final time. And that is exactly why you belong here. He was gone. The recovery room was quiet. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall. She watched it come down in the light from the training compound, soft and without urgency. The kind of snowfall that her father had always called patient snow, the kind that intended to stay. She thought about Building 9 and what waited inside it. She thought about missions that would never carry her name, about the specific silence of work done in the spaces between official records, about blue markers moving through corridors that would never be attributed to a person who, on paper, had washed out a basic training with 2 hits out of 5 on a qualification range in a 43-knot wind. She thought about her father in Wyoming with his coffee going cold and the particular quality of his breathing after she had given him what she could. She thought about the patch on the bed beside her, the single white line through the center, the space between visible and invisible, the operational margin where the real calculations happen. She put the dead man's switch in her chest pocket, close to her heart, where she would feel it. She put the phone in the desk drawer, face up. The last image on the screen, a photograph of herself and Earl on a frozen hillside in the Bighorn Mountains, both of them prone in the snow, the ranch visible in the valley far below. Her 11 years old and learning for the first time to listen to the wind's heartbeat. She looked at the falling snow. Her father's voice, "Don't fight the cold, become part of it." She had thought she understood that when she was 11. She had understood it differently at 12, and again at 16, and again on a qualification range at Fort Caldwell when the wind hit her at 43 knots and her body did what physics required and the math said she was done. She understood it differently now. The cold was not something you survived. It was something you became. And the becoming was not a loss. It was the thing that made you capable of work that the warmth could never do. Work that happened in the frozen margins, in the patient dark, in the space between visible and invisible, where the real wars were decided by people whose names would never appear in any account of them. Nora Calloway had failed basic qualification. The system had measured her and returned a verdict. And then a man in a black helicopter with no markings had looked at everything the system had decided to discard and seen something the system had no instrument for, no test design for, no standard built to detect. Not strength, not speed, not the loud, visible power that filled the boxes the military had constructed for bodies larger than hers. Stillness, cold. The absolute and practiced ability to become nothing in a place where nothing was the most dangerous thing you could be. She was 23 years old. She had no official record of anything that had happened in the last 26 hours. She had a fractured tibia, a destroyed knee, and 2 patches of frostbite on her left hand that Dr. Wexler had noted clinically and she had noted as the price of the work. She had a patch with a white line through the center. She had a dead man's switch. She had her father's voice in her chest. And somewhere in this facility, Building 9 waited with the missions that had no names, and the work that had no record, and the particular community of people who had all stood in the same doorway she was standing in and made the same calculation she had already made. She closed her eyes. Her heart rate settled to 44. Her breathing slowed to the threshold of visible. The snow fell outside with the patience of something that intended to stay. And Nora Calloway lay still in the dark and felt the future settle into her the way a held breath settles before a shot. In the moment between one heartbeat and the next, when everything that is going to happen has already been determined, and all that remains is to be still enough to let it. She was still. She was cold. Outside, the patient snow kept falling. And Nora Calloway, who had failed basic qualification on the coldest night of the year, closed her eyes and listened to the wind find its rhythm in the dark.